This is a presentation about the PREMIS Event Service as it is used by the meta-archive cooperative. But before going into how we use the PREMIS Event Service, I'd like to first go over what a PREMIS event actually is. A PREMIS event is one of the four entities of the PREMIS metadata standard that was developed by the Library of Congress and a number of other libraries. The PREMIS metadata standards records preservation information about digital objects, and it does this through four entities. The first is the object entity, which describes a digital object itself. The second is the event entity, which we will be discussing a little bit more in detail. The third is an agent entity, and an agent entity can both be a human, such as the librarian or repository manager performing an action, and it can also be a tool, such as the software that performed an action. And a final entity, which is the rights entity, that describes the intellectual property related to the object entity. And so you can see very quickly that any event that occurs within a repository can be described by a group of these four events. You have an object that has an event occur to it, and an agent performs that event, and an agent has the correct intellectual property rights that agree with the object intellectual property rights to be allowed to perform that event. But all of this is fairly high level and abstract, and so to look at what an event might actually be, the Library of Congress publishes a list of PREMIS event types that they use within their own system, and they publish this for use by other libraries to use as controlled vocabulary for their own PREMIS event types. And you can see here that this list includes ideas such as the capture of information, the compression of information, the deletion of information, a fixity check performed upon information, a virus check performed upon information. However, you're free to define your own PREMIS event types. This is just a good start and something to get your ideas going if you decide to implement the PREMIS event service. So, a PREMIS event is a very useful concept to have. As I said, you can record almost any action that you take in your repository with a PREMIS event. And that allows you to actually create an audit trail of all the actions that have been performed upon a digital object that you can use both to prove the authenticity of that object, as well as perform various managerial and administrative tasks in terms of evaluating the efficiency and regularity of your repository. However, in order to actually use PREMIS events, you need a system or a service to register, record them, and allow you to recall them for later usage. Some systems support it natively, but what the University of North Texas libraries have done is create a system purely for the management of PREMIS events, and that can be incorporated into almost any system via API calls to its AtomPub API. The Django PREMIS Event Service is available via GitHub it's available on GitHub. It's written in Django, which is a framework for Python. However, your system does not need to use Python or Django in order to be able to access this software. What you do need to have is the ability to write your own code and to send API requests via that code within your workflow. As the PREMIS Event Service is open source software, it's freely available for download and for modification. The University of North Texas has also provided extensive documentation for the PREMIS Event Service on Read the Docs. This documentation includes installation, configuration, administration, and development information. With that overview complete, I'd like to show very quickly how we in the Meta Archive incorporate the PREMIS Event Service into our workflows. And so, as I said, you need to have the ability to write code for your workflows in order to incorporate the PREMIS Event Service. And so what I'm showing now is the code that backs up the database that we use within the meta archive to manage our collections. And this piece of code right here, if you're reading Django, is a piece of code that allows our members to upload metadata describing their disaster recovery collection or disaster recovery procedures to our database. And you can see all of this is regular code to upload the actual file. But at a certain point, once the file is actually uploaded, we trigger a PREMIS Event Service Atom URL. And this Atom URL contains several objects. It contains the PREMIS event type, which in this case is VIR for virus check, because we are virus checking this upload. It contains a message, virus scan on file, and the path of the file name. It contains the agent that performed this action, which in this case is the conspectus, the name of our software. And it contains the result of the action, in this case a success if the virus check was successful, or a failure if the object turned out to have a piece of a virus infection. So that looks pretty abstract, but once we fire off that API call, it gets registered into the PREMIS Event Service. And so here's the interface for the PREMIS Event Service, and you can see we have several event types happening here. There is a create metadata type where whenever metadata is added to one of our objects. Here's a virus check, which is about the check of a upload of a file. We also have several other event types. For instance, this audit archival unit hashes, which is where we check the fixity of objects that are stored within our LOCKSS network. You can go into further detail on any individual event type. And as you can see, there's quite a few fields that you can fill out for every event. You just have to add this into the event call that you place into your code. You can also search the events for actions that have happened and use this to create reports about your repository. You can also search for the different agents that are reporting events into the system. So there's quite a few management functions available right off the bat within the PREMIS Event Service. That concludes this overview of the PREMIS Event Service. This is not a public-facing tool. This is something purely for the management of a repository, and something that once implemented should help you be able to monitor and improve your repository